Arthur Vincenzo sat in the same booth every morning. It was a corner booth, vinyl cracked like old leather, facing the door. From here, he saw everything. He saw the city wake up through the condensation on the glass. He saw the hurried steps of people with places to be, faces tight with worry or ambition. He saw the rhythm of a world he owned but no longer truly lived in. His world was one of shadows and whispers, of loyalty bought with fear and respect earned with violence. This diner was different. It was a small island of fluorescent light and the smell of burnt coffee in his vast, dark ocean. For 8 months, he had come here. At precisely 7:30 in the morning, his long black car would pull up to the curb. His driver, Leo, would get out first, his eyes scanning the street. Only then would Arthur emerge, a man carved from old stone, his face a roadmap of a hard life. He wore tailored suits that could not hide the bulk of his shoulders or the stillness of a predator. And every morning, for 243 days, the same waitress would approach his table. Her name was Clara. He knew this not because she wore a name tag, but because he had made it his business to know. He knew she was 26 years old. He knew she worked a double shift 4 days a week. He knew she lived in a small apartment 3 neighborhoods over, in a part of the city his men kept clean. He knew her son, a boy named Thomas, was 7 and had a sickness in his lungs that stole his breath. Clara would approach his table, her hands trembling just slightly. She never looked him directly in the eye. Her gaze was always fixed on a point just over his shoulder. The usual, "Mr. Vincenzo," she would ask, her voice a fragile thing. He would simply nod. A moment later, she would return with a thick ceramic mug. Inside was black coffee. Bitter. Scalding. Arthur Vincenzo hated black coffee. He had not willingly drunk it since he was a young man, poor and hungry, when it was all he could afford to keep warm. He preferred his coffee with 2 sugars and a generous pour of heavy cream, a small comfort in a life that afforded him few. But he never corrected her. He never said a word. He had seen the tremor in her hands the first time she served him. He had seen the exhaustion etched into the delicate skin beneath her eyes. He saw a weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. It was the weariness of a soul stretched too thin, pulled between hope and despair. Correcting her seemed like an act of cruelty. A small stone added to a load that was already breaking her back. So he drank the bitter coffee. He would take a slow sip, letting the acrid taste wash over his tongue, and he would nod his thanks. He would leave a $100 bill under the mug, a silent transaction she never acknowledged beyond a slight dip of her head as she cleared the table after he left. This morning was different. The tremor in her hands was worse. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She placed the black coffee on the table, and some of it sloshed over the side, a dark tear on the white saucer. She flinched, expecting a reaction. Arthur remained perfectly still. He simply pushed a napkin over the small spill. She stood there for a moment too long. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. She turned and fled back to the kitchen. Leo, sitting opposite him, a silent sentinel, raised an eyebrow. "Something's wrong with the girl, boss." Arthur did not reply. He already knew. He had felt it in the air the moment he walked in. The usual hum of the diner was off-key, replaced by a thrum of tension. He watched her as she moved through the small space, a ghost in a pale blue uniform. He watched her force a smile for the old man at the counter. He watched her hand shake as she refilled a water glass. Then, she stopped. She stood in the middle of the diner, her back to him, her shoulders beginning to shake. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She turned. Her eyes, for the first time in 8 months, met his directly across the room. In them, he saw a desperation so profound it was like looking into an abyss. She started walking toward his booth. Not with a coffee pot. Not with a check. She walked with the heavy, determined steps of someone with nothing left to lose. Leo's hand instinctively moved to the inside of his jacket. Arthur raised a single finger from his lap. A small gesture. An absolute command. Leo's hand froze. Clara reached their table. She did not speak. She just looked at him, tears finally breaking free and tracing paths down her pale cheeks. She reached into the pocket of her apron. Her hand emerged, a fist clenched tight. She opened it. On her palm lay a small, pathetic pile of crumpled bills and loose change. $17.42. Her tips from the morning rush. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I need to hire you." The diner fell silent around them. The clatter of cutlery stopped. The low murmur of conversation died. Everyone was watching. Leo stared, his mouth slightly agape, a look of pure disbelief on his face. To hire Arthur Vincenzo. Men with fortunes offered him percentages of their empires for his services. They offered him fealty. They offered him their lives. And this girl, this waitress with haunted eyes, was offering him $17.42. Arthur looked from her tear-streaked face to the meager pile of money in her hand. He felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate of ice and memory that had been frozen for decades. He saw not a waitress, but another young woman from a lifetime ago, her face pale with fear. He saw his wife. He saw his daughter. He saw the ghosts he drank bitter coffee to forget. He looked back at Clara, a girl young enough to be his grandchild. And in that moment, Arthur Vincenzo, the man who controlled the city's underbelly with an iron will, made a decision that broke every rule he had ever lived by. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will change not only their lives, but the very definition of justice in a city that had forgotten its meaning. If you're enjoying this story, please show your support by giving this video a like and hitting that subscribe button so you don't miss what we have coming up. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Arthur Vincenzo was not a good man. He knew this. He had made his peace with it long ago, on a cold night when he was just a boy, hungry and alone. Good men starved. Good men were victims. Good men died on their knees, begging for a mercy that never came. He had chosen a different path. He had chosen strength. He had built an empire on foundations of fear and intimidation. His name was a password in the dark corners of the city, a key that opened doors others found locked, a threat that silenced arguments before they began. He was a predator, and the city was his hunting ground. But even predators have rules. A code. Arthur's code was simple, brutal, and absolute. You do not betray family. You do not break your word. And you do not, under any circumstances, harm women or children. They were civilians in a war they had not chosen to fight. They were to be untouched. Inviolate. This rule was not born of chivalry. It was born of pain. It was forged in the fire of a memory he could never escape. The memory of a ringing phone in the middle of the night. The memory of a rival's voice, cold and triumphant, telling him that a message had been sent. The memory of a quiet suburban street filled with flashing red and blue lights. He remembered the smell of burnt wood and gasoline. He remembered the face of a firefighter, streaked with soot and pity, telling him there were no survivors. His wife, Elena. His daughter, Sophia. Gone. A message. The men responsible had learned what it meant to break Arthur Vincenzo's rules. Their ends had been slow, inventive, and spoken of in hushed tones for years afterward, a grisly bedtime story for aspiring gangsters. But their demise had not brought his family back. It had not filled the cavernous silence in his home. It had only left him with the ghosts and the code. A code to protect the innocent, because he had failed to protect his own. He looked at Clara, at the raw desperation in her eyes, and he saw the echo of his own failure. He saw a vulnerability that screamed for a protector. "Tell me," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the diner's silence. The word was not a request. It was a command. Clara's story came out in a torrent of whispered, broken sentences. It was a common, ugly tale. Her son, Thomas, needed a new medicine. An experimental treatment the insurance company refused to cover. The bills piled up like snowdrifts, burying her. She had borrowed money. She had gone to a man named Sal Risley. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew the name. Sal the Weasel Risley. A bottom feeder. A loan shark who operated on the fringes, preying on the weak and the foolish, the people who were too desperate to go to a bank and too insignificant to come to men like Arthur. Risley was a jackal, snapping at the scraps left behind by the lions. The interest rate was criminal. Clara fell behind. Of course she fell behind. That was the point of men like Sal. The debt was designed to be impossible to repay. It was a leash. Yesterday, Sal had come to her apartment. He had not been alone. He had told her the time for payments was over. He had told her she would have to start paying in other ways. He had looked at her. Then he had looked at her son, Thomas, who was struggling to breathe on the sofa. And he had smiled. Pretty boy like that, Sal had said, his voice slick with poison. Could be useful. There are people who pay good money for things. For little helpers. A cold, clean rage settled over Arthur. It was not hot and explosive, but chilling and absolute, like the heart of a glacier. Sal Risley had not just broken the code. He had taken it, spat on it, and set it on fire. He had crossed a line that even the most degenerate animals in their world knew not to cross. He had threatened a child. For money. He gave me until tomorrow morning, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. To get him the full amount. $20,000. Or his coming back. For Thomas. She looked at the pathetic pile of money in her hand again, a bitter, hopeless laugh catching in her throat. This is all I have, she said. I know it's nothing. But I heard people say. I heard them say you help people. That you're the king of this part of the city. I didn't know who else to ask. She was asking a wolf to protect her from a jackal. She did not understand that they were both creatures of the same night. Arthur looked at her, then at Leo. Leo's face was grim. He understood now. This was not business. This was a violation. Arthur slowly reached out his hand. Not for the money. He gently closed her fist over the crumpled bills and coins. You keep your money, he said. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. You have hired me. This is my payment. He tapped a finger against his temple, where the memory of his daughter lived. The memory of her laughter. The memory of her small hand in his. The memory of a promise he had made to her ghost, a promise to never let what happened to her happen to anyone else. Not in his city. Not on his watch. Clara stared at him, confusion warring with a fragile bloom of hope in her eyes. What are you going to do? Arthur looked past her, his gaze fixed on the grey city street outside the window. His mind was already moving, pieces falling into place, a dark and terrible machine grinding into motion. This was not a problem that required negotiation. This was not a misunderstanding to be mediated. This was a disease to be excised. I am going to have a conversation, Arthur said. Leo knew what that meant. A conversation with Arthur Vincenzo was the last one most people ever had. Arthur pushed himself out of the booth. He stood to his full height, casting a long shadow over the table. He looked down at Clara. Go home, he commanded gently. Lock your door. Do not open it for anyone but me. Do you understand? She nodded, mesmerized by the sudden authority, the absolute certainty in his voice. Be with your son. Those 4 words held a universe of meaning for him. A universe of regret. He placed his hand on Leo's shoulder. Pay for the coffee, he said. And get the car. As he walked toward the door, the other patrons in the diner averted their eyes. They had witnessed something. They did not know what it was, but they understood the shift in the atmosphere. They knew the old man in the expensive suit was more than he appeared. They had just seen the king of the jungle reminded that he was, in fact, a king. Outside, the air was cold. The city noise seemed distant. The black car idled silently at the curb. Leo opened the back door. Arthur slid onto the leather seat. The world inside the car was quiet, insulated, a bubble of power moving through a city of the powerless. Leo got in the driver's seat and looked at Arthur in the rearview mirror. "Where to, boss?" Arthur stared out the window, his reflection a pale mask. Inside, the glacier of his rage was beginning to move, to crack, to carve. The memory of his daughter's face was sharp, painful. A 7-year-old boy. Thomas. Sal Risley had made the fatal mistake of putting a price on a child's life. Arthur Vincenzo was about to teach him that some debts can only be paid in blood. "We need to find Sal Risley," Arthur said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "But not yet. First, a stop at the bank. The girl needs $20,000. And then, call Michael and Frankie. Tell them to meet us. Tell them to bring the tools." Leo nodded, his expression hard. He understood. The tools were not for construction. They were for deconstruction. The plan was simple. Simplicity was elegance. And in Arthur's world, elegance was efficiency. They would not storm Sal Risley's office. They would not kick in the door of his sleazy, smoke-filled gambling den. That was messy. It was loud. It drew attention. Arthur preferred the quiet. He preferred the dark. "We will go to his home," Arthur said, as if discussing the weather. "A man is softest in his home. He is weakest. He believes he is safe." Arthur knew where Sal lived. It was his business to know these things. A small, gaudy house in a new-money suburb, a place where fences were low and neighbors kept to themselves. A place built on the illusion of safety. An illusion Arthur was about to shatter. The first step was the money. Leo drove to a discreet private bank where Arthur's name was the only identification required. Arthur went inside alone. He returned with a thick manila envelope. $20,000 in crisp, untraceable bills. And something else. He had withdrawn an additional $100,000. A fund for a boy's medicine. A fund for a new life. A down payment on a debt he owed to a ghost. Next, they waited. They parked in a quiet street 2 blocks from Sal's house. Michael and Frankie arrived in a nondescript panel van. They were large, quiet men who had been with Arthur for over 20 years. They were not thugs. They were professionals. They understood the nuances of their craft. They got into the back of Arthur's car. There were no pleasantries. Arthur laid out the plan in less than a dozen sentences. The target was Sal Risley. The reason was a violation of the code. The objective was a permanent resolution. Michael and Frankie simply nodded. They did not ask why. They did not question the order. The boss had spoken. That was enough. They waited for hours as the sun arced across the sky and dipped below the horizon. The streetlights hummed to life. Windows in the surrounding houses glowed warm and yellow. Families were eating dinner. Children were being put to bed. It was a world away from the cold purpose inside the black car. Finally, a flashy sports car turned onto the street. It roared down the block and swerved into Sal Risley's driveway. Sal got out. He was a small man, dressed in clothes that were too loud and too expensive. He carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a bully. He unlocked his front door and disappeared inside. Arthur waited. He let another 10 minutes pass. Let him get comfortable. Let him take off his jacket. Let him pour a drink. Let him believe his day of preying on the weak was over. "Now," Arthur said softly. The 4 men got out of the car. They moved with a synchronized, silent grace. Frankie went to the back of the house. Michael went to the side. Leo and Arthur walked up the front path. Leo carried a slim leather case. Inside was a set of tools that could open any lock ever made by man. He had the front door open in under 10 seconds. They slipped inside. The house smelled of cheap cologne and stale cigar smoke. The television was blaring in the living room. Sal Risley was on the sofa, his feet up, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He did not hear them enter. He did not sense the change in the air. He was safe in his castle. Arthur stepped into the doorway of the living room. Leo stood behind him. Frankie and Michael appeared in the other doorways, blocking all exits. The trap was set. Sal looked up, a flicker of annoyance on his face at the interruption. The annoyance curdled into confusion, then into pure, cold terror as he recognized the man standing before him. He dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Vincenzo," Sal stammered, scrambling to his feet. What is this?" "I pay my tribute." "I'm good." "We're good." Arthur took a slow step into the room. His eyes were flat, his face impassive. "We are not good, Salvatore." The use of his full name made Sal flinch. "You broke a rule," Arthur continued, his voice quiet, conversational. It was more terrifying than any shout. I don't know what you're talking about," Sal said, his eyes darting between the four silent men. "I run a clean business. No trouble." Arthur smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "You visited a woman today, Salvatore." "A waitress." "A single mother named Clara." Recognition dawned on Sal's face, followed by a wave of disbelief. "The girl from the diner? This is about her?" "She's a nobody. She owes me money." "She has a son," Arthur said, his voice dropping even lower. "A sick boy named Thomas." He took another step forward. Sal took a step back, bumping into the sofa. He was cornered. "You threatened him," Arthur stated. It was not an accusation. It was a verdict. "You stood in their home, a place that should be a sanctuary, and you put a price on a child's head. You looked at a sick, 7-year-old boy, and you saw a product to be sold." Sal started to sweat. He could feel the net closing around him. "It was just talk," he pleaded, holding up his hands. "Just a way to scare her, to get my money. I wouldn't have touched the kid. I swear." "You do not get to swear," Arthur said, his voice like the scrape of a tombstone. "You do not get to talk. You do not get to breathe the same air as that boy." Arthur stopped, standing just a few feet from the trembling loan shark. "I had a daughter once," he said, the words hanging in the air like frozen smoke. "Her name was Sophia. She was 7 years old when a man like you, a man with no honor, decided to send me a message." He let the silence stretch. He let Sal contemplate the implications of that statement. "The message you sent today, Salvatore," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto Sal's. "I am here to return it." He nodded once to Leo. That was the only signal needed. The resolution was swift. It was silent. It was permanent. When they left the house 20 minutes later, it was as if they had never been there. The television was off. The broken glass was cleaned up. The only thing out of place was the silence. A profound, unending silence where a worthless life had once been. Sal Risley would not be bothering anyone ever again. His disappearance would be a minor mystery for a few weeks, then he would be forgotten, another piece of city trash swept away in the night. The drive back into the city was quiet. Leo glanced at Arthur in the rearview mirror. The old man's face was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the passing lights. But Leo thought he saw something different in his boss's eyes. Not peace. Arthur Vincenzo would never know peace. But perhaps, for the first time in a very long time, a small measure of satisfaction. A wrong had been righted. A debt had been paid. Not Sal's debt to Clara, but Arthur's debt to Sophia. They did not drive home. They drove back to the diner. It was late, but a single light was on in the back. Arthur got out of the car alone. He walked to the front door and knocked gently. A moment later, the door opened a crack. Clara's frightened face appeared in the gap. When she saw it was him, she opened the door wider. She was holding a baseball bat, her knuckles white. Her eyes were wide with fear and questions. "It's over," Arthur said simply. "He will not bother you again." The finality in his voice was absolute. She did not ask what he meant. She did not need to. She knew. The relief that washed over her was so immense her knees buckled. She leaned against the doorframe, the bat clattering to the floor. Tears of exhaustion and gratitude streamed down her face. Arthur held out the thick manila envelope. "This is for Thomas's medicine," he said. "And for a new start. Away from here, if you like." She stared at the envelope, then back at him, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "I can't. This is too much." "I am not asking," Arthur said. "I am repaying a debt." "But—" "I hired you," she said, her mind still struggling to catch up. She fumbled in her apron pocket and pulled out the crumpled $17. "This was our deal." Arthur looked at the small pile of money in her hand. He gently took one of the crumpled dollar bills from her palm. He left the rest. "My payment was $1, he said. "The rest is yours. What you gave me today was worth more than money." You reminded an old man of something he had forgotten. He folded the single dollar bill carefully and placed it in his breast pocket as if it were a priceless artifact. Clara looked up at the fearsome old man, the city's dark king, and saw something else. She saw a protector. She saw a savior. She saw a profound and terrible sadness. Are you a good man, Mr. Vincenzo?" she asked, the question a genuine, innocent search for understanding. Arthur was silent for a long moment. He looked out at the dark, sleeping city. His city. A place of saints and sinners, of wolves and sheep. He had been a wolf for so long he had forgotten what it was to be anything else. "No," he said finally, his voice raspy with a truth he had long accepted. "I am not a good man." He turned his gaze back to her, and for a fleeting instant, she saw a flicker of the man he might have been in a different life. "But tonight," he added, a hint of something like warmth in his tone. "Tonight, you let me be." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple white business card. There was no name on it. No company. Just a single phone number, written in black ink. "If you or your son ever need anything," he said, pressing the card into her hand. "Anything at all. You call this number. You and the boy are under my protection. For life." He turned to leave. "Wait," Clara said. He stopped, his back to her. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of an emotion too deep for words. "For everything." Arthur nodded once, a barely perceptible movement in the darkness. He walked back to the car and got in. Leo put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. They drove in silence for several blocks. Then Arthur spoke, his voice clear and steady. "Leo. Tomorrow morning, I would like to try the coffee with 2 sugars and cream." 5 years passed. The city changed, as cities do. Buildings rose and fell. Names that were once whispered with fear faded into obscurity. The world kept spinning. In a quiet, sunlit corner of that city, a small diner thrived. It was called the North Star. It was clean and bright, always filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of warm conversation. The owner was a woman named Clara. She had bought the place 2 years ago from the old proprietor, who was retiring. The money had come from an anonymous trust, set up by a mysterious benefactor who stipulated only that the diner be a safe and welcoming place for all who entered. Clara's son, Thomas, was 12 now. He was healthy. Strong. The sickness in his lungs was a distant memory, vanquished by the best doctors and the best medicines money could buy. He helped his mother at the diner after school, a bright, smiling boy with his mother's kind eyes. He was a good student. He wanted to be a doctor when he grew up. He wanted to help people who were sick. He had no idea how close he had come to a different, darker fate. His mother had protected him from that knowledge. Her, and a quiet old man she had not seen in years. Miles away, in a large, stately house overlooking the river, Arthur Vincenzo sat in his study. He was an old man now, truly old. The iron in his will had turned to rust. The fire in his eyes had cooled to embers. He had retired, passing the reins of his empire to Leo, a man he trusted as his own son. He spent his days reading, listening to old records, and watching the river flow by. His house was quiet, filled with the ghosts of his past. But he was no longer haunted by them. He had made a sort of peace. On the ornate mantelpiece in his study, among photographs of men long dead and trophies from a violent life, were two items that did not belong. One was a faded photograph of a little girl with dark, laughing eyes. His Sophia. Beside it, propped up in a small, elegant silver frame, was a worn, crumpled, $1 bill. His payment. He looked at it every day. It was a reminder. A reminder that even in the deepest darkness, a single act of compassion can light a path forward. A reminder that power is meaningless unless it is used to protect the powerless. A reminder that the measure of a man is not in the fear he commands, but in the hope he inspires. For in a world full of monsters and shadows, the greatest strength is not the will to conquer, but the courage to care. And sometimes, the most profound act of redemption begins with something as simple as drinking a cup of coffee you do not like, simply because you refuse to add to another person's pain.